Hello, finance students. Welcome back. We're in ICA 42. We are looking at capital structure ratios. We're looking at two of them, specifically the debt ratio and the time interest earned ratio. Again, just a reminder, the whole point of ratios is that they are meant to be compared. And so we're going to calculate these and take a look and compare them to historic trends and also to what's going on in the industry averages. So for the debt ratio and the times interest earned ratio, these capital structure ratios look at how did the firm finance their assets. And we know through our studies so far in finance that organizations finance their assets two ways, through debt and equity, through bonds and stock that we see. So these are going to look at both of those and how the firm has used both debt and equity. So first of all, looking at the debt ratio, what percentage of assets were financed using debt, short-term and long-term? And this reminds us to look at total liabilities compared to total assets. So we're going to compare our total liabilities to our total assets. So to find this, we are going to equals, and we find both of our liabilities and our assets on the balance sheet. So we go to the balance sheet down here, and we look for our total liabilities, not total current liabilities. We want total liabilities of $193,437 that are in cell G, G20, and we're going to divide that by the organization's total assets, which we find total assets of $321,686. So once we have our G20 divided by C21, then that gives us a debt ratio of about 60%, which tells us about 60% of Apple's assets were financed through debt, through short and long-term liabilities. Now, looking at this number, there's a couple of different ways we can look at this, and it depends on the person who is looking at this. And you look at three different groups. You can look at creditors, we can look at stockholders, and we can look at managers. So in general, when we think of creditors and managers, they want a low debt ratio. They don't want a lot of debt hanging out there, because if there is a high level of debt, that means a lot of the company's revenues and net income that's left over is going to pay for interest on the loans that they have taken out. Remember, for debt, for bonds, as we discussed, the payments on the debt, the interest payments are required to be made, whether or not the company has a good year or a bad year, whether they end up in the black or in the red. So when you have a high level of debt, you are required to make those interest payments, and that's not necessarily good for creditors and for managers. For creditors, they want a low debt ratio because they want to be able to get paid. That shows to creditors that you can pay off your debt, and there's also a lower potential for a loss or a lower level of risk for the creditors to get paid. And for managers, that also means a lower debt ratio means there's less money wrapped up in interest payments, and that's more money for them to spend on salaries, employees, research and development, and so on. However, the other group, stockholders like to see this number be a little bit higher. The reason is they don't want to saturate their stock supply in the marketplace. So if you have a lower level of debt, that means there's a higher level of equity that's used to finance assets. So if you have a higher level of equity, that means you are increasing the supply of stock that's out there. And we know through economics that higher supply typically means a lower price on something. So although creditors and managers typically like a low debt ratio, stockholders are okay with a higher debt ratio to a certain point. And most financial analysts and experts would agree that point is about 80 to 90% debt ratio. When you get higher than that, then you really start seeing significant hindrances for the organization and what they can do. So we see our debt ratio of 60.13. Obviously, Apple is financed significantly more in their debt than the industry that we have. Not necessarily good or bad, just depends on how you look at it. The second and the other ratio we're going to look at for ICA 42 is times interest earned. And in essence, what this is how many times does our EBIT, our earnings before interest and taxes, covers just the interest obligation. So if for some reason we get into financial distress and we can only cover our interest obligation on our debts, how many times can we do that? So to find that, we're going to look at our EBIT, our operating income. We're going to divide that by our interest expense. So to do that, we type in equals, and we find our EBIT on our income statement Our operating income is $60,024, and we're going to divide that by our interest expense, which is right below that here on the income statement at $1,500. We hit enter, and so that gives us a times interest earned of 40.02. So we see that Apple can cover just their interest obligation about 40 times. So they're sitting pretty strong and pretty healthy when it comes to debt obligation.